Pontiac had built a machine that seemed almost impossible to kill, but the same forces that made the GTO famous would eventually become the reasons it disappeared. So how did one of America's greatest muscle cars go from a symbol of performance to a car Pontiac could no longer justify building? And why did Pontiac kill the legend it had helped create? The answer wasn't just about horsepower. It was about changing times, rising costs, government regulations, insurance companies, and decisions inside Pontiac that would ultimately seal the GTO's fate. In the early 1960s, Pontiac was trying to change its image. The brand had once been associated with conservative family cars, but Pontiac's new leadership wanted something different. They wanted younger buyers, more excitement, and cars that could make people look twice. The opportunity came from an unexpected place: the Pontiac Tempest. Engineers John DeLorean, Bill Collins, and Russ G. realized they could fit Pontiac's larger 389 cubic inch V8 into the relatively lightweight Tempest. It was a simple idea, but it created something special. Pontiac added performance upgrades, stronger brakes, a sportier suspension, and aggressive styling, then gave the package a name that would become legendary: GTO. When the GTO arrived for 1964, Pontiac wasn't sure how buyers would react. Technically, it was an option package rather than an entirely separate model, which also helped Pontiac get around General Motors' restrictions on large engines in smaller cars. But buyers didn't care about corporate rules. They cared about what the GTO could do. For a relatively affordable price, they could get a car with serious V8 power and the attitude of a much more expensive performance machine. Pontiac had unknowingly created the formula for the American muscle car, and the rest of Detroit was about to take notice. The GTO didn't stay a simple option package for long. Pontiac quickly realized it had created something much bigger than expected. As word spread, the GTO became a symbol of speed and youth culture. Its combination of a powerful V8, aggressive styling, and relatively affordable price made it one of the most desirable performance cars in America. Pontiac continued improving the formula, offering bigger engines, more power, distinctive hood scoops, and increasingly aggressive styling. By the late 1960s, the GTO had become one of the names most closely associated with the muscle car era, and Pontiac wasn't alone anymore. Chevrolet had the Chevelle SS, Oldsmobile had the 442, Buick had the GS, Dodge had the Charger and Challenger, and Plymouth had the Roadrunner. Detroit had discovered that Americans loved big engines in relatively affordable cars. The GTO had started the race, and suddenly every manufacturer wanted to win it. But the GTO's success created a dangerous problem. Once every automaker started building powerful muscle cars, Pontiac had to keep making the GTO faster, more exciting, and more desirable. That meant bigger engines, more equipment, and higher costs. For a while, buyers were happy to pay, but the environment around the GTO was beginning to change, and Pontiac wouldn't be able to ignore those changes forever. By the late 1960s, the GTO had become far more than another fast Pontiac. It represented an entire generation of American performance. Its long hood, wide stance, roaring V8, and aggressive attitude gave it an identity that ordinary family cars simply didn't have. Buyers weren't just purchasing transportation. They were buying excitement. Pontiac understood that perfectly and continued pushing the GTO's image through advertising, styling, and performance. The Judge package added even more attitude, with bold graphics, distinctive colors, and a reputation that made the GTO stand out wherever it went. But there was another reason the GTO became so important. It proved that a muscle car didn't have to be an exotic or expensive machine. A young American buyer could walk into a Pontiac dealership and leave with serious V8 performance without spending the kind of money normally associated with high-performance cars. The GTO made performance accessible, and that changed what American buyers expected from their cars. For Pontiac, however, success came with a price. The bigger the muscle car market became, the more pressure there was to deliver more power. And just as the GTO reached the height of its reputation, The world around it was beginning to turn against cars like it. Then the muscle car era began to run into a new reality. By the early 1970s, the environment that had allowed cars like the GTO to thrive was changing rapidly. Insurance companies were raising premiums for high-performance cars, especially for younger drivers. Suddenly, owning a powerful GTO could cost much more than simply paying the price on the dealership window. At the same time, new emissions and safety regulations were putting pressure on automakers to reduce pollution and improve vehicle safety. Then came another major problem: the economy. Rising fuel prices made large displacement V8s harder to justify for everyday buyers. The GTO's greatest strength, its powerful engine, was becoming one of its biggest disadvantages. Buyers who once wanted enormous horsepower were beginning to think about fuel economy, insurance costs, and practicality. Pontiac tried to keep the GTO alive, but the formula was becoming harder to maintain. The muscle car market was shrinking, competition was changing, and the GTO was no longer operating in the world that had made it famous. The legend wasn't suddenly destroyed. It was slowly being squeezed from every direction. By 1971 and 1972, the pressure on the GTO became even harder to ignore. Pontiac was still offering serious performance, but the muscle car formula was no longer as simple as adding a bigger engine and more horsepower. Federal emissions requirements were tightening. Insurance companies were making high-performance cars increasingly expensive to insure, and the rising cost of fuel was changing what many Americans wanted from their cars. The same young buyers who once dreamed about owning a GTO were now facing higher insurance bills and a very different economy. Pontiac responded by reducing the GTO's performance and making it more difficult to justify as a dedicated muscle car. The 455 V8 was still available, but horsepower ratings had fallen dramatically compared with the peak years of the late 1960s. At the same time, competitors were struggling with the same problems. The entire American muscle car market was shrinking. And this is where Pontiac faced its biggest challenge. The GTO was built for an America that was disappearing. The roads were changing, government rules were changing, fuel prices were rising, and buyers were becoming more practical. The GTO hadn't suddenly become a bad car. The world around it had simply stopped rewarding the things that made it special. Pontiac now had a difficult choice. It could continue investing in a shrinking muscle car market, or it could move toward the kind of cars that GM believed would make more sense in the changing American market. The problem was that the GTO's identity had always been built around performance. Once the power disappeared, Pontiac had to find another reason for buyers to care. The 1973 GTO showed just how difficult that had become. It was no longer the dominant muscle car of the late 1960s. Its design was softer, its performance was far less shocking, and the market itself had changed. Buyers had more reasons to consider fuel economy, insurance costs, and practicality than ever before. Pontiac tried to keep the name alive, but the magic was fading. Then came 1974. Instead of continuing the GTO as part of the larger A-body lineup, Pontiac moved the name to the compact Ventura. It was a smaller, lighter car, but that change created a serious problem. The GTO no longer looked or felt like the GTO people remembered. The legendary name was still there, but much of the identity behind it was gone, and Pontiac was about to make its final decision. By 1974, the GTO had become almost unrecognizable compared with the car that had started the muscle car revolution a decade earlier. Pontiac moved the name onto the compact Ventura, hoping the lighter body would help preserve some of the car's performance character. The idea made sense on paper, but the market had changed too much. Buyers were no longer demanding the huge engines and aggressive performance that had made the original GTO famous. Even with a V8 available, the 1974 GTO couldn't recreate the excitement of its predecessors. Sales reflected the problem. The legendary name that once represented an entire generation of American performance was now attached to a car struggling to find its place. Pontiac decided there was no longer enough demand to keep the GTO in the lineup. Default text. After the 1974 model year, the Pontiac GTO disappeared. There was no dramatic final race, no massive farewell, and no grand celebration. One of America's most influential muscle cars simply ended. But the story wasn't really over, because the GTO had already changed American performance forever. So, why did Pontiac kill the GTO? The answer wasn't one single decision. The GTO was caught in the middle of a changing America. Stricter emissions rules, rising insurance costs, higher fuel prices, and a shrinking muscle car market all weakened the formula that had made the GTO successful. Pontiac also struggled to preserve the car's identity as performance declined. By the time the GTO disappeared in 1974, the market that had created it was almost gone. But Pontiac didn't really kill the GTO alone. The era that created the GTO was dying with it. The car had already done something far more important. It helped create the American muscle car movement and inspired generations of performance cars that followed. Even decades after its final production year, the GTO remains one of the most influential American cars ever built. And perhaps that's the irony. Pontiac killed the GTO, but it could never kill the legend.